Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webcast entitled 6 Things Marketers Should Know About Data and Privacy. I'm very glad that everyone is taking a little bit of time out of their probably very busy schedules to talk about a really important subject, and I think also an exciting subject, because it really is something that's special to this moment in time, since so much is happening in the world around us and in our own industry, that I think it's worthy of a nice chat today. Real quick, let me introduce myself. My name is Adam Corey. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Tealium. If you don't know Tealium, we are the leader in real-time customer data solutions. Our Universal Data Hub really allows folks to manage their tags and vendor integrations, but also build an omni-channel data supply chain and action engine that allows them to bring their data to new heights and also build customer experiences across their existing ecosystem of technology vendors. One other way to look at this, real quick before we hop into today's webinar, is by taking advantage of the marketing stack and customer data points that you have today and using those as data sources to feed one universal data strategy that allows you to not only control and understand and gain insights, but take action on those data points and those customer relationships across every aspect of your vendor ecosystem. And that includes, from the Tealium side, over 1,000 pre-built turnkey integrations. Now, with that, I thought I would start off today's conversation with a personal story that has led me into this part of my career and really where I am at Tealium and really how we work with customers. I started my career many years ago, and I actually took a screenshot of abcnews.com, which is where I started my career, on my first day, or one of my first days at the company. That's actually 600 pixels across, so I didn't shrink it down. It's actually, that's apparently how small our monitors were back then. But I bring this up because shortly after I joined, in about 2000, we moved from doing log file analytics, which is to say looking at our web logs that are captured on the server and analyzing it to say what was happening with our articles, what were people reading. We moved from a log file-based system to a cloud-based analytics solution, and that was even before the concept of a cloud really existed. I think we called it SaaS-based back then. And that was a huge shift for us at the time, because what it meant was we were able to understand what was happening with our business and the content we were producing, but also what was happening with the people on the other side of the monitor, the folks that were coming to our site to learn about the day's news, to go deep into topics. Instead of understanding what happened last week and what performed well last week, we could understand what people cared about today. What were they clicking on from the homepage? What were they searching on? And that was a huge leap forward in understanding and bringing customer interest, intent, and behavior right to the forefront of how we ran our day-to-day operations. And obviously, 17 years or so have passed. People tell me, fortunately, I'm still the same age, but we've progressed as an industry about 17 years, and a lot's changed. I think the future of experience brings us to a different world. No more is the digital realm really confined to just a web browser. The digital realm is really a physical realm, and our opportunity and our responsibility with data has never been greater. And I think one of the ways in which this is well articulated is just in the way we use apps and data and digital experiences to literally navigate the physical realm. And so with apps like Uber and many others, we're looking at what experience can be created through digital programs, but also the data that's generated from those experiences. Before we get into talk about data and privacy specifically, it's important to think about the parallels that's happening in our industries and really for us as consumers and us as humans, really. I think in many ways, business models are becoming much more experience-based than we've seen historically. And in a lot of ways, that experience that you have with a brand is in some ways maybe more important than the product that they provide. There's a great stat. MasterCard every year does an omni-channel shopper report, and they look at various trends, but one of the really interesting ones that came out about a year ago was in the U.S., the number of places that consumers are shopping is actually starting to tick down. And one hypothesis for this is that potentially we're spending more money, but we're spending more money at fewer places, and maybe fewer places that can build the best experience for me, that can build the best offering and build the best relationship for me. I think to, again, talk a little bit about myself, I took stock of really all the places where I spend money, and we already talked a little bit about Uber, but in many of these other cases where I buy my eyeglasses, where I rent my car, where I got my dinner delivered last night, even where I get my water filter, these are a lot of disruptors in their own categories in many ways, but they're also folks that are building a very different and many say disruptive experience in their own right, and leveraging data to build that experience, but also leveraging data to understand how they're able to build better customer relationships and what's happening as a result. So I think we're seeing that the way that we approach data as a way to fuel experiences is even changing our concept of what personalization will be, which is, personalization, I think, in my mind, is being driven more by the value and the relationship and the experience that can be built, and maybe less so than just conversions. Back, again, 17 years ago, we were talking about personalization when I worked at ABC. But our concept and our notion of what personalization meant was very different than what it could mean today. I think for a lot of us, the idea of personalization being an opportunity for me to put the right next product for somebody or show someone a particular idea of an article that they could click on was just the beginning. But I think now we're seeing great examples of building entirely new experiences and maybe even new products as a result. This next example was inspired and brought to my attention by Shar Van Barskik at Forrester for some of her great conversations around how CMOs are tackling this. And she brought to my attention the idea of this really brought to life with what Gatorade's doing with their SmartCap, which is the idea of building a product that is looking at your hydration levels based on a patch that you might wear and the bottle itself to give you feedback as to how much you need to hydrate and what your body levels are, and then therefore how much you could consume or should consume. And really, this is personalization when you think about it. This is using data and providing data to build something that's totally new that we've never actually had before, and doing so with the use of really creative technology and thinking about how could I as a brand provide value to my end consumer. And I think this is just one of the most interesting examples out there, but we see these all around us. So as we think about today's conversation, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that if we want to build really great experiences with our customers, with our partners, and build great relationships through those experiences, we need to understand data in, I think, a new and more fundamental way, and think about how we can better protect it. So today as we dive in, I thought it's important that we make sure an undercurrent of the conversation is really around data protection and also customer trust. Forrester has talked about how legacy practices, or those that we have maybe had in place inside of our own businesses, aren't really adequate to really think about what is going to work for the new age that we're entering into. For those of you that are familiar with GDPR in Europe, that plus other interesting rulings and conversations that are happening are really starting to shine light on this particular area. And I think as folks who work with customer data, we have to be able to confront this head on and not necessarily relying on privacy policies that we don't read or other back of the book explanations of how things work. We've got to bring our approach to customer data protection, data handling to the front page to really make sure that from a brand perspective, customer trust is really core to the way that we're communicating. I did mention in here that this is an active conversation right now. This is very much an active conversation. Since I had my first cup of coffee this morning, a ton of news has come out following some of the congressional votes on how ISPs and other edge providers can work with your data and share data. And it's brought to the forefront, I think, a conversation that's been going on in various ways. And so I just grabbed a few of the headlines and op-eds just from this morning, so that way we know that while this is certainly talked about in the news, this means that there's a conversation happening not just in Congress or not just in Europe in legislation there, but this is bringing forth a greater conversation with our users about how they feel about how their data is handled. So as we think about this, there's an increased focus from all aspects. I think consumers on the other side of the computer, and also we as consumers, are really thinking about what data is known about me and what data, how data is used and where that data is shared. So I think consumers are curious or concerned and really want to make sure that their data is handled with respect. I think in some ways, the providers of a lot of the technology out there are looking to make sure that they're protecting their own walled gardens. Governments certainly are looking at this issue as well on both sides of it, both sides of the continuum. And also businesses need to think about their own processes as a result to just make sure that proactively they're protecting themselves from not only building customer trust and making sure that they're building the right experiences, but also making sure that they follow on the right side of both the law, but also the right side of making sure that data is protected at every step of the way. So as we talk about some of the things that we need to think about as marketers or brand professionals or customer-facing professionals, all of us, I wanted to distill it down to about 6 items for us to dig into today. We're not going to dig into GDPR specifically today. There's a number of great conversations that we've been a part of and panel discussions which we'll share with you, or you can scroll down after today's webcast and look at some of the other content. I do encourage you, if you are not yet up to speed or would love to learn more about GDPR, that's a great place to get started. But today we're going to talk about some of the more macro conversations that apply across the board. So to start off, I referenced this before, but I thought it's always worthy to provide some supporting data. And that's to really think about the fact that consumers are thinking about this. They're concerned, they're talking about, and they're wanting the brands and companies that they patronize to make sure that they know that this conversation is top of mind. A study earlier this year found that close to 90% of consumers basically say that they won't shop from or won't patronize companies that don't adequately protect their data. That's a very large percentage. That's pretty much all. And so for us to think about what that means, it really makes it incumbent upon the brands and the retailers and all of us as businesses to make sure that we know that in mind, and we're not waiting to be reactive, but we're being much more proactive in communicating to customers about how data is used and making sure that we're building the right experiences based on that data. A fascinating tidbit that also came from that report was that 70% of consumers were actually more concerned about their data collection and privacy than they were about losing their primary source of income, which I found just absolutely fascinating, as if you have to ask people to rank their larger concerns, that how their data is handled is really one of their biggest concerns. And I think in a lot of ways, it's not just around what I might have as an individual brand, what I might know about you, but if we think about just how pervasive digital experiences and the opportunity for data to be generated from us as consumers, it makes perfect sense why consumers really want to make sure that they have a say in how their data is collected, how it's shared, and what privacy rights and practices they can actually follow and take part in. And then if you need any other supportive data points, I encourage you to go on Twitter today and just throw in the privacy hashtag and see what conversations are already brewing today. So where do I take action on the fact that our consumers and the folks that are coming to your website and my website today, how do I make sure that I'm starting to build the right conversation with them? So we're going to talk through the same concept really in a lot of the points, but I thought it's important to talk about what I can do today. surprisingly, and this is anecdotally, but I've asked many of my peers in various other industries that are focused on building customer experiences or run marketing organizations, how many of them have actually read their privacy policy on their website. And I guess I'm surprised or not surprised that most of them have not. And I think in a lot of ways that's a concern, not only from the fact that we as marketers and brand professionals aren't necessarily taking the time to look at what is being communicated to our customers, but this is also potentially telling us that the way in which we might bury information inside of privacy policies and make privacy policies not actionable is not really helping our cause. So I think it's important that we look at how we can take an inventory of what our privacy policy says and also what vendors and data is actually a part of that. Where does that data go? How do all the vendors that I work with to build my customer experience handle things like opt-out and do not track? And we've surveyed companies and found that most organizations have at least 20 vendors to build just their front web experience alone, not to mention other aspects of their customer experience and their mobile applications, et cetera. So that could be a lot of different vendors that handle data, and that could be a lot of different vendors that may need to handle opt-out and do not track. So the next step is to really look at where a single approach to managing how my vendors are implemented, how data flows, and how I handle privacy settings is really one of the first steps that we need to take inventory of. The next is really an acknowledgement that access to customer data really requires what I call a value exchange. And I think many people have talked about this different ways, but what I mean by value exchange is that for me to maintain the access to data about my customers and to build my ability to gain insights about them, it means that I need to make sure that I'm providing something in return. And this doesn't mean that I need to provide a coupon or a promo code to get information out of consumers. I think that's actually the opposite of what works today. This really goes to the fact, and Gartner has a great quote in a piece that they put out last year saying, customers really just aren't going to tolerate companies that have amnesia when it comes to their preferences. And this really underscores the fact that the experience that I build that face my customers has to be mutually beneficial. So if I want my consumers to tell me more about who they are, I need to actually take advantage of that. If I'm asking them to provide information about what they care about and preferences, et cetera, I need to make sure that they don't think that I have amnesia and that I'm not taking action on that. Because that value exchange is really what feeds our ability to build greater long-term, durable, scalable experiences. So if you think about that, if we start up at the top, the fact that access to data at the very most core level, call this core customer data, identity information, preferences, et cetera. To get that to a company, I need to make sure that there's something of value that I'm providing back. And again, not a coupon or a promo code, but I need to make a promise from my brand that says that, hey, I'm not only going to take advantage of this information to build you a better experience out there, but I also want to make sure that I'm telling you how this information potentially is being used. I'm building a relevant experience, and I'm building a more personal experience for you, that I'm actually making this a smarter part of the customer experience that then comes back to the customer, that builds a continual circle that allows me to enrich and build more of an understanding about who my customers are. So that way I can, again, differentiate and grow my relationship with my consumers. So thinking about ways to take action here, again, the idea of taking stock inside of at least just my marketing and my customer-facing teams about how we're using data. And I think one way to do that is to build a data roadmap that talks about what data do we have at our disposal today and how are we using that data and what's our long-term goal for better understanding, building attributes, and enriching our visitor and customer profiles, and how are we going to take action. You can't outweight the collection without thinking about the value end of that. So you have to make sure that these two are a balanced roadmap that continue along the lines. And this has to be something that I need to think about across my channels. So thinking about how this fits into a universal data strategy across, again, my 20+ vendors, the different channels that I work on, and devices that share that data. I think this is an important aspect of making sure that if I remember someone on my web channel but forget about them in my mobile channel or in store, is that really upholding my end of the value exchange? Maybe not. I think we can often, as internal members of our customer experience and customer-facing teams, we can often get bogged down with the technical constraints or the integration requirements or the development resources that are required to make some of the most elegant experiences possible. But our consumers don't view it that way. And so when they view that there's a possible moment of amnesia or an experience that's not seamless, this is really pointing to the fact that we're not upholding our end of the value exchange, and therefore it becomes a question as to, are we going to continue to gain access to this rich, wonderful data that our consumers can share with us to build our relationships? Excellent. So the next one is thinking about what data I have, and is all data equal, and is it equally leveraged? So there are a few things in this that I think are interesting. And I think to start, it's important to think about the types of data that we as marketers have access to. More in the advertising side of things, a lot of us have leveraged DMPs and third-party data that describe who our audience potentially is and who we'd like to target in our ad programs. And for those of you who maybe haven't ever gone and looked at what third-party data providers know about you, I thought I would just send a snapshot of what of the 362 different data points that are collected about me, what I am all about. So I am a woman 27% of the time, according to some of these third-party data providers. I have 2 to 3 kids, which is not true. I don't have any yet. I live in Tennessee. I do not actually. I live in California. My family of 5 earns about $2,000 over the federal poverty level. Again, I'm a family of 1. And I like Yoplait yogurt, boating, and board games, which is interesting. I don't know if I've ever expressed any of those online as an interest, but again, these are interesting data points about me that show that maybe this isn't the right information about me, and certainly not disparaging third-party data by any stretch, but thinking about what is the data that builds the experience as a brand that starts really all the way up the funnel from an advertising standpoint, and am I being relevant, and am I actually targeting the right folks and starting the right conversation? So even something as simple as making sure that everyone in the organization that touches data really thinks about what data you have and thinks about it in the proper areas, which is what first-party data do we know about our customers that they've shared with us that we've learned because of their browsing behavior on our website or what they've purchased or when they've called into our call center. Second-party data, which is potentially data that's shared privately amongst other companies. And then third-party, which is more on the open market data that can be used for targeting or used within DMPs or other platforms that allow me to target people from an advertising standpoint. This is, in my world, those 362 other data points that are collected about me. But knowing really how is data leveraged in my entire customer lifecycle and customer experience, and that starts all the way up the funnel. This is, when we think about how much data that is, this is where it becomes, I think, fascinating. The fact that data is just generated at insanely fast rates about us as individuals. But in a lot of ways, we don't necessarily know what to do with that data or know how to work with that data. And a lot of that data is actually redundant or obsolete. So the fact that of all the data that companies are actually working with, according to a survey from Veritas, only 14% of that data is actually really known. And an even smaller amount of that data is actually leveraged and used to build better experiences. In a survey that we did with a company called TechValidate last year, we found that really only 27% of brands that collect data are able to actually take action on it. So we're collecting more than we're using, which I think makes sense for those of us that have been in the analytics and really in the digital space for a while. But it does make us think back to that value exchange. Are we collecting more than we're upholding our end of the bargain? And are we collecting with the right approach and with the same respect that we need to make sure that we have to continue our ability to maintain that relationship and access to data? I'm going to pause here for a second to talk about one of the ways in which this is important, and that's really in the very first place that maybe I'm interacting with my consumers, maybe on my website or in a mobile application. And it's the fact of creating what's called a data layer, which is really just an articulation or a list of what data points you have or know at that point about that content or that homepage or that product. And the fact of building a data layer is an important process for many organizations that maybe haven't thought about this another way, because what it does is it actually makes you think about what data is at your fingertips, not necessarily what data is being asked of you by different parts of the organization, but what data do you have access to, and think about how consumers interact with those data points, and then think about how you're leveraging and how that data can be made available throughout the organization. This process, I think, is one of the first starts to building a governance program or building a more cross-functional and sustainable approach to understanding what is inside of your first-party data inventory. What do you have and what could you know? And therefore putting everyone, including your vendors, on the same page to say, here's what I'm letting you have access to, and making sure that that's transparent and actionable across the board. So thinking about one of the things that, if you haven't started down the path of building a data layer that establishes what I'm calling a vendor-neutral approach to defining my data, it's really maybe a pre-vendor approach, which means what do I know about my website, about my products, about my customer experience? And let's go ahead and take inventory of that, and then think about, from that master list, what data is missing, what data needs to be added, and then how am I going to make sure that that data is managed across my teams, my tools, and the technologies and vendors that use them. So this is also an interesting start to the conversation that allows me to build a single customer view and build a data protection strategy and also build a better BI strategy. I think oftentimes those three are started separately. I have my marketing team that maybe is starting to build my universal customer view. I have a BI team that may even be collecting or importing or bringing data from other sources that maybe is outside the marketing organization to understand and gain insights into my customer. And then I might have a compliance and a legal team that is taking a different approach to understanding how data throughout the organization flows, not just customer data. This really allows us to start to think about how these are all intertwined and how they can work together. Building on the idea of those first two bullet points is to think about that data layer and really start to build a data flow inventory and also map. So in my organization, the idea of documenting what my data layer is and how data flows to different technologies is an important step to make sure that I'm able to communicate internally and also understand and build a sustainable program that understands what does my organization do with data. And that really goes down to understanding at the root level what data do I collect and how does it go to vendors, and what is the flow and exchange of data that exists there. And then if there are disconnected or inaccurate data that may be leading to bad customer experiences, that's something that can be easily identified and to say, hey, we're not sending the complete amount of information to this particular channel or team, so maybe they're not getting a full understanding. And this allows you to kind of combat what's, I think, often the case inside of some organizations, which is data hoarding, or folks that are collecting data and maybe building in their own silo. It allows you to shift that conversation a bit from, hey, we need to smash down those data silos inside of an organization, and really take a step back and say, hey, it's not about smashing down. It's really a matter of getting organized and connecting how different parts of my organization think about the data that they collect and making sure that we're all on the same level and sharing the right information and making this transparent inside of the organization so that we're able to have a more thoughtful relationship and use of that data outside the organization. I wanted to pause here to take a deep breath because for those of you that perhaps have looked at GDPR and thinking about how new policies are coming into place, or even how we're thinking about working with making sure that we're managing privacy in the right way, it can often seem overwhelming and can often, I think, make us think that we need to start from scratch. Which sounds better than it often is. And one of the things that I think we've heard that make people think about this is one of the requirements for GDPR in Europe is really stipulating that everything that you do has to really think about privacy from the get-go. And I think a lot of us think about, hey, does that mean that I should really rip out everything and start from scratch? Wouldn't that be wonderful if we all weren't barreling down the freeway at 80 miles an hour with our businesses? But really, I think we need to think about the years that we've spent establishing processes and teams and platforms and vendors to measure our own performance, to understand what our customers care about, and making sure that we're thinking about those in line with one another. Symantec did a survey recently where they asked if companies think they're going to be ready for GDPR, and 3/4 of them said, nope, we don't think we are. And I think because a lot of companies are still wrestling with the fact that do I need to start from scratch? Do I need to change my vendors? Do I need to think about a completely new approach to technology? And the answer is, it's not necessarily that I need to replace systems or smash silos. It's really a matter of taking an inventory and taking stock to say, what is it that we're currently doing? And let's use this as a great opportunity to define where there aren't processes and refine where there are existing processes around what data we're working with. So that means things like, where is our personal data about our customers stored? How is it used? Again, that data flow map that we talked about in the last point of what is the data, where is it stored, and where does it flow? And then what security measures do we have in place, and what third-party vendors and even what internal members of my team are allowed to access it? These are not things that need to be ripped and replaced and started from scratch. These are simply taking an inventory of what processes you have, and if you don't have them, this is a great opportunity to think about how to put them in place. GDPR is something that will take effect in a little over a year. And while it is a European bit of legislation, it does really impact anyone around the world who is interacting with European citizens. So for a lot of us, we can use this as a great blueprint to think about what our next steps are. I think unlike in the last decade or so with legislation and directives and other initiatives that have come out that have maybe been a little bit grayer in what they're asking of marketers and brands and companies, one of the great things about GDPR is that it's starting to define a real set of rules and actually what I need to make sure that my internal processes are adhering to and following what the law is saying. So I should use this, and I should take this opportunity as a brand leader and as a customer insight professional to say, hey, I'm going to use this as a blueprint. Even if my business focuses in the U.S. and we have very little, if any, European customers, this is something that is certainly a consumer trend, or there are other forces that make this a great opportunity for me to make sure that I'm compliant with what's happening in Europe, and I'm building the great experience and the best of breed practices inside of my organization to make sure that I'm protecting my customer data. Because I think even if you take GDPR out of this entirely, and we go back to that first bullet point, the fact of being able to think about where personal data is stored, how it's used, and what measures are in place to make sure that it's protected, this is really core to just the fact that there's so much data that we have access to, and it's really part of our end of that value exchange. It's part of our end of the responsibility that we have as people who have access to and hold on and build our customer relationships based on data. This next one is, I think, one of the more exciting things which isn't necessarily something that you would have thought of being exciting or an opportunity here, which is the fact that data protection and how we use data is actually one of the best ways to drive internal partnerships inside of your organizations that I've ever seen. I can't tell you how many times I've been at companies or a part of them that really try to get cross-functional or centers of excellence built around certain things that really have a hard time articulating to various aspects of the organization what's in it for them. The WIFM, the what's in it for them. This is one of those opportunities that there are so many parts of the organization that can benefit from working together that it really becomes a pretty powerful cross-functional opportunity that you have, which is to think about, let's say, these 5 areas that exist within most organizations. I have my marketing team. I might have a completely separate customer experience team or customer support team. I have a data and business intelligence team. In some ways that might fall under one of those earlier 2, or that might be its own entirely separate department and team. I have a development team, my technical folks that maybe are building my experiences or building my product or building my mobile applications. And then I have a privacy and data security or a compliance team or a legal team that is interested in how this data is handled. And if you think for a second, outside of the privacy conversation, et cetera, if I'm not able to connect what I know about a customer across all of these different areas, it really delays my ability as an organization to respond to an opportunity raised by a customer in the moment. If I'm not sharing data seamlessly across all of these teams, if I'm either have silos that don't talk to each other, or I rely on batch processes or people to bring data from one point to another, I'm not able to do what is best to breed and build a real-time experience. I may be missing an opportunity that might exist with my consumers. They may have moved on to a new idea because I didn't present them with the next best step in my relationship with them. Think about our business intelligence teams that we have and our analytics teams. If I have different disconnected silos inside of my organization, I don't necessarily know that I have access to all of that data. So if different parts of my organization are working with different sets of data and I don't have the complete view of that and the master set, I don't sit at the midpoint of the customer data supply chain, that really creates blind spots for me that maybe could result in poor decisions or bad customer experiences because I'm acting on and I'm informing other parts of the organization to take action on maybe incomplete data. And then, of course, not knowing what all of the teams are doing maybe introduces privacy and legal risk. If I don't know how data is handled and where tags are collecting data and what vendors those flow through and what internal processes have access to data, there's a question that needs to be answered from a privacy and a legal standpoint that it gives an opportunity to be able to build around. So when we think about that, this allows me to do things like, inside of our own product, give version control and user access and make sure that people have access to profiles about what vendors can be added and what vendors can't and who on the team can be able to see data and who can't see data. This is really giving the ability for me to find some commonality inside of my organization so that I can see where does my need as a marketer. I want to build a universal customer profile so that I can better target and better nurture people on a more personalized, valuable path through the marketing experience. My BI team wants to get access to all that data, and my compliance and privacy and legal teams would love to be able to understand what all this data that flows through. If we have a common approach at an organizational level that thinks about how data is governed across the organization, and even a center of excellence inside of the organization that says, here are how we share best practices and how we build our own processes that aren't just for the marketing org, but really are organization-wide, this really allows me to build great partnerships that allow me to have a common goal as a result. Think back a couple of slides ago to that idea of taking a data inventory and even building that data flow diagram. The idea of that being able to better help my BI team understand what data they could have access to. also allows me as a marketer or customer experience professional to say, hey, these data points would actually really help me better understand this audience or what people care about. And certainly helps the legal and privacy and compliance teams to say, okay, great, we were going to come and ask you anyway to put this together, so it's great that we're ahead of the game and we're being much more proactive about this approach. The last bullet point that I wanted to bring up in this is, and this is a great example which we'll link out to after today's presentation from a partner of ours, Blast Analytics and Marketing. And a common customer that we have that really, I think, if ever there was somebody that had more attention paid to them around how they handle this, it would have to be healthcare.gov. And there's a great case study which I encourage you to read, which we'll send out after this, which goes into greater detail here. But they really wanted to make sure that in the area of consumer privacy, that they were able to combat any sort of concern, negative attention, et cetera, and make sure that they put transparency and consumer options, not just back of the page, but really front and center in their conversation with customers, and making sure that they were making it clear to the folks that come over to healthcare.gov that they care about, respect, and are proactively starting the conversation around how data is handled and giving users the ability to take more control over that. So for them, they really, with the help of Blast, really used the idea of data protection and really privacy as a differentiator. And if you think about this for a moment before we dig into some of the examples here, that's a pretty powerful example or an idea around how being proactive in this era of customer confusion and concern, et cetera, how by getting our ducks in a row and getting our internal teams organized and making sure that we share that with the world, it really allows us to add a brand promise and add something core to the way that we communicate with our customers that potentially could give us a better way to stand out above the noise level and certainly stand out above and away from some of the competitors in our own space. So for healthcare.gov, what they did with the help of Blast, which was to say they used a tag management solution, which was a free solution out there called Google Tag Manager, but that didn't give them the ability to have this organizational-wide or this transparent approach to managing who has access to and how is that data leveraged. So they migrated all of that over to Tealium IQ, our tag management solution, so that they could give users control over what tracking and data collection it takes place during their visit. So they're able to do this, and I'll show an example in just a moment. They're able to do this at the same time that their teams are able to gain some efficiencies by using a single view of building customer data or building individual data points and implementing different vendors and technologies and campaign tags and vendor tags. They're able to solve both sides of this, which I think these types of synergies is really core to making things sustainable. If I can use the same solution to provide transparency and give user control during their visit about how data is handled, and also gain efficiencies within my teams and also get a greater ROI out of the solutions that I use, that is what's called a win-win. So to look at what that looks like, if you are on healthcare.gov and you click into their privacy policy, it actually makes their privacy policy actionable. So instead of just reading a bunch of information, which they did a great job at making it a really human readable and relevant and great privacy policy, but using Tealium Privacy Manager, they were able to make it actionable and put some control back in the user's hands to say, hey, you can opt out of everything if you want to, and in fact, we'll honor do not track settings in your browser by default. Even if all of the vendors maybe that are out there in the MarTech landscape maybe don't honor do not track in browsers to the degree that they should, if you have a universal approach to managing customer data and vendors through Tealium, I'm able to say, look, I'll honor your do not track, but hey, if you actually want to be more granular about this, I'll give you the ability to control your privacy options at a much more specific level to say, in their case, there are 3 different areas, advertising, social media, and web analytics, and to say, hey, do you want to allow data collection and control of this at the advertising level, at the social media level, or the analytics level? And so as a consumer, you could say, you know what, don't really want this information shared with advertisers or social media, but you know what, I'm totally happy for you guys from an analytics standpoint to collect this information. This is, I think there aren't a lot of examples outside of some of the companies that work with Tealium that are doing something to this level. And I think since this is something that's out of the box, it's almost a no-brainer to be able to give people the ability to have more control, to start that conversation right at the forefront, and be able to make sure that you're showing how trust and protection of data and control are core to what your brand and what your promise is to consumers. So as we wrap up today, I want to take a couple moments to talk about some of the takeaways as well. And again, I encourage you to explore here in the channel both the GDPR conversations that we've had recently, as well as there is a presentation of what I just walked through with Blast Analytics and Healthcare.gov that you can explore from a conference that we hosted last year. So I encourage you to watch that as well. But from today's conversations, the takeaways are really to think about these 6 things that I, as an organization, need to start acknowledging and training and educating my own internal teams, which is, hey, this consumer concern is certainly there, so let's acknowledge it and be proactive about it. Let's acknowledge the fact that if we want to maintain our access to this customer data, that it requires a quote-unquote value exchange. I need to think about what data I have. Is it all equal, and is it equally leveraged? I need to take a breather and not worry about I need to rip and replace everything and start my life over. No, it's really a great opportunity to think about building processes, refining the processes that I have, and making those processes known and communicated at the next step internally. So I can use this as a way to not only solve my needs as a marketer, but also solve the needs that my compliance team, my BI team, even my tech teams may have with how they work with, or their questions around how they can work with data. And then finally, once I do these, I can actually use this as a way to make data protection and privacy something that's core to my brand promise and something that allows me to differentiate from others. So as I think about now what I can do starting today, let's think about the 3 things that are kind of incumbent or important about this value that consumers expect from us and how we as consumers expect from the brands that we work with. It would be great to be transparent about how data is handled and what data is used, either explicitly or also in the tangible benefits and the value of the relationship and the lack of amnesia that is adopted across the organization by listening to what's important and using it. And then the third point, to make sure that I'm protecting it so that I can make sure that I'm upholding my responsibility on my side. Other aspects, getting into specific things that you can start within your organization, in addition to some of the take action points that we talked about earlier, is really perform my due diligence. Understand what policies currently exist in place and what my customer experience is that impacts those policies. Think about auditing the data flows, building that data flow so I can understand where data resides, who has access, et cetera. Take that data inventory, build the data layer if I don't have one, so I can have an understanding of what type of data is being processed and how it's handled. Build controls to make sure that the people inside of my organization have the proper permissions to add or not add or impact that part of the data supply chain. And then use these as a way to build bridges inside. And if that means building a center of excellence or a data governance team in your organization, or making sure that you understand what that team is and how it impacts yours, I think that's really something that allows you to activate and build a more proactive approach to working with customer data, and something that will pay it back in spades, again, because it meets different parts of the organization's needs but solves a common purpose. And then finally, see where we can put privacy front and center. I think this is an area that our customers and our users and visitors on our sites and in really any of our digital experiences, it's on their minds. So let's make sure that we're being clear, we're communicating about that, and when we're building experiences based on data, that we're making sure that we're upholding our end of the value exchange. So with that, I want to thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to walk through this with you. I encourage you to share any questions here as well, which we'll follow up offline around. And then for those of you that want to dig into some other areas of the conversation around GDPR or privacy management, I encourage you to look at some of the other videos that we have on the channel and ask your questions there as well. So thank you again for your time, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.